On the morning of September 26, 2002, a man walked along the eastern side of Mount Waryong in Daegu, South Korea, searching the hillside for acorns. He was not looking for a crime scene. He was not part of a police operation. And he had no reason to believe that the ground beneath the trees held the answer to a mystery that had haunted an entire country for more than 11 years. Then he saw something among the leaves. Bones, shoes, pieces of clothing. The discovery was close to the place where 5 elementary school boys had been heading on March 26, 1991. It was also just outside the area police said they had searched most thoroughly. Within days, testing confirmed what 5 families had feared for more than a decade. The remains belonged to Cheol-won, Ho-yeon, Kim Young-gyu, Park Chan-in, and Kim Jong-sik. The children the country remembered as the Frog Boys had finally been found. But the discovery did not end the mystery. It made the mystery worse. Police initially suggested that the boys had become lost and died from exposure after rain and cold moved across the mountain. Forensic specialists disagreed. They found trauma on at least 3 of the skulls and argued that the condition and arrangement of the remains pointed toward homicide. Bullets and cartridge cases were found near the site. The mountain stood close to a military shooting range. The boys had vanished on election holiday, a day when the nearby unit said no scheduled firing exercise had taken place. Their families accused investigators of losing evidence, overlooking witnesses, and failing to search the right ground. Police reviewed tips, theories, and possible weapons, but no suspect was charged. And the question that began on a rainy election day in 1991 still has no proven answer. How could 5 children walk toward a familiar mountain, disappear during daylight, and remain hidden for 11 years in a place searched again and again? To understand why this case still troubles South Korea, we have to return to the morning when the 5 boys left home. March 26, 1991 was not an ordinary weekday in South Korea. It was a temporary public holiday for local elections, the first such elections in about 3 decades. Schools were closed, adults were focused on voting, and news organizations were preparing to cover a major political moment. In Daegu, 5 boys from Songseo Elementary School had the day free. The oldest was Cheol-won, 13. Ho-yeon was 12. Kim Young-gyu was 11. Park Chan-in was 10. The youngest, Kim Jong-sik, was 9. They lived in the same general neighborhood and knew Mount Waryong well. It was not a distant wilderness expedition. The mountain rose only around 300 meters and stood close to their homes. Local children visited its slopes, paths, and shallow waterways to play. Later reporting clarified an important detail that had been repeated incorrectly for years. The boys were widely called the Frog Boys because early media accounts said they had gone to collect frog eggs. According to a friend's account, they had actually planned to look for salamander eggs. That small correction matters because the nickname became larger than the boys themselves. Over time, the Frog Boys became a national symbol, printed on posters and repeated in documentaries. But before the headlines, they were simply 5 children using a day away from school to explore a familiar mountain. They left their homes at around 9 in the morning. At first, there was no emergency. Children playing outside for several hours was not automatically treated as a crisis. The mountain was nearby, the route was familiar, and the boys were together. A little after 1 in the afternoon, however, Cheol-won's father was informed that his son had failed to arrive for a taekwondo lesson. That absence changed the meaning of the morning. The boys were not where they were expected to be. They had not returned home. The families began checking the places children might go, asking friends, searching paths, and trying to determine exactly where the group had last been seen. As the afternoon continued, rain fell and the temperature dropped. Later records cited a daytime high a little above 12 degrees Celsius and a morning low close to 3 degrees. Those conditions would become central to the first official explanation after the remains were found, but in 1991 the immediate concern was simpler. 5 children were missing at the same time. The early police response has remained one of the most criticized parts of the case. According to later documentary reporting, local authorities initially treated the disappearance as a possible runaway situation and advised the parents to wait. The families did not believe 5 young boys had independently decided to leave their homes, miss their obligations, and disappear without taking money or supplies. They believed the mountain had to be searched immediately. The problem was timing. South Korea's attention was fixed on the election. Newsrooms were occupied. Police resources were directed toward public order and voting security. What would soon become one of the country's most famous missing child cases began in the shadow of a national political event. By evening, the boys had still not returned. The familiar slopes of Mount Waryong no longer looked harmless. The paths that had seemed close to home now opened into dark ground, wooded sections, rocky ridges, and areas connected to military land. Parents, relatives, and local residents began calling the boys names and checking routes they could have taken. The search continued into the night, and then into the next day. No clothing was found. No bag was found. No message arrived. No witness came forward with a confirmed account of seeing all 5 boys leave the mountain. 5 children had walked away from their neighborhood during daylight, and the first critical hours ended without a reliable trail. At first, the disappearance received limited media attention. The election dominated the news. But within days, the story changed from a local concern into a national emergency. The basic facts were easy to understand and impossible to ignore. 5 elementary school students had left together. None had returned. Their destination was known. Their faces could be placed on one poster. Their families were united in the same nightmare. Television coverage expanded. Newspapers printed photographs. Appeals were broadcast across the country. The government eventually offered a reward of 42 million won for information leading to the boys. Police and military personnel were mobilized on a huge scale. Later reporting placed the total at roughly 320,000 personnel, searching more than 140,000 locations. Around 22 million flyers were distributed. Images of the children appeared on postcards, videotapes, and even cigarette packages. The scale was extraordinary, but the volume of activity did not produce a dependable lead. Search teams examined Mount Waryong and surrounding areas. Soldiers, officers, and civilian volunteers moved through paths, brush, and hillsides. The mountain was searched repeatedly over the years. Some accounts later said it was examined hundreds of times. Yet the place where the remains would eventually be discovered was not identified. This failure sits at the center of the case. The boys were not found in another province. They were not discovered across an international border. Their remains were on the same mountain connected to their last known destination. For the families, the official effort soon became only one part of the search. The fathers of the 5 boys left their jobs and committed themselves to finding their sons. They traveled the country in a truck carrying a large banner with the children's photographs. They handed out flyers, visited locations mentioned in tips, and followed claims that often had no evidence behind them. For most people, a tip is a phone call. For the families, every tip created a decision. Ignore it, and it might be the one piece of information that mattered. Follow it, and it might lead them hundreds of kilometers away for nothing. They received reports from people who believed they had seen the boys in markets, stations, roads, and cities. They heard claims that the children had been kidnapped, trafficked, adopted under false identities, or hidden by someone who knew the families. They also heard from shamans and self-described spiritual advisors. Later reporting said the fathers received hundreds of such claims. One prediction sent them to Daegu, where they searched through a garbage truck because they were desperate enough to investigate anything that might end the uncertainty. Nothing did. As the weeks became months, the meaning of the search changed. During the first days, the families could imagine finding the boys cold, frightened, and alive. Later, hope became more complicated. A confirmed sighting would mean life. Silence could mean almost anything. The absence of evidence allowed theories to multiply. Perhaps the boys had left the mountain and entered a vehicle. Perhaps an adult had lured them away. Perhaps they had witnessed something dangerous. Perhaps they had entered the military area. Perhaps they had suffered an accident in ground that searchers had missed. Each possibility had believers. None had enough evidence. The search also exposed a recurring problem in high-profile missing person cases. Public attention creates information, but it also creates noise. The more famous the boys became, the more false witnesses, rumors, and invented confessions reached police and parents. Investigators had to separate fact from imagination, but the original trail was already cooling. There was one reported witness account that would remain especially troubling to the families. A 4th-grade student reportedly said that he heard a terrible scream from the mountain on the day the boys disappeared. The families later argued that this statement was not investigated with sufficient urgency. The scream could not be independently tied to the 5 boys. It did not identify a location, a person, or a cause, but it suggested that something unusual may have happened on the mountain during the hours when the boys were missing. The families also questioned how thoroughly police had examined the nearby military base and shooting range. Mount Waryong was not only a recreational area. Military facilities and training land complicated the geography and created a theory that would remain attached to the case for decades. Could the boys have reached a restricted area? Could they have witnessed unauthorized activity? Could an accident involving military personnel have been concealed? Those questions became widely discussed, but discussion is not proof. The military said no training was scheduled on the election holiday. No verified record has established that soldiers killed the boys, and no named service member has been publicly proven responsible. Still, the families believed important possibilities had been dismissed too quickly. Meanwhile, the fathers kept driving. Year after year, the same faces stared from the side of the truck. The children in the photographs did not age, but their parents did. In the first year, the missing boys were everywhere. Television programs featured the families. Public campaigns encouraged people to study the photographs. Volunteers distributed flyers. The case entered schools, workplaces, and homes. The nickname Frog Boys made the story memorable, but it also simplified it. 5 separate lives became one phrase. 5 families became one national tragedy. The country knew the case, but knowing the name was not the same as knowing what happened. By 1992, the disappearance had already influenced popular culture. A film inspired by the case appeared while the boys were still missing. Songs and public campaigns kept their photographs visible. For the fathers, visibility was necessary. A case that left the headlines might lose its chance of being solved. They understood that public memory had to be maintained deliberately. But public attention follows cycles. New crimes occur. Political crises replace old stories. Viewers who once watched every update eventually assume that police will announce an answer when one exists. The families could not move on in the same way. They were caught between 2 possibilities. Their sons might be alive somewhere waiting to be recognized, or the boys might have died close to home, in place the search had failed to reach. That uncertainty influenced every decision. A funeral could not be held without remains. A legal declaration could not answer a parent's questions. An unverified sighting might reopen hope after years of disappointment. In 1996, the case took one of its most damaging turns. A professor associated with the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, who had studied criminal psychology, publicly alleged that all 5 boys had been buried beneath the home of Kim Jong-sik, the youngest child. The accusation placed suspicion inside a grieving family's property. Police excavated the site. They found no evidence. The professor was later fined for defamation, but the damage could not be fully reversed. The search had moved from a mountain into the private home of a victim's family based on an unsupported claim. For the parents, this was more than another false lead. It showed how a famous unresolved case could invite confident theories from people who had no reliable evidence. The families needed investigators to test possibilities, but each public accusation also exposed them to humiliation and suspicion. The excavation produced nothing, and the case returned to silence. By then, years had passed. The boys' classmates were becoming teenagers and adults. The missing posters still showed children aged 9 to 13. Police files grew thicker, but the central timeline remained almost empty. They left in the morning. They intended to go toward Mount Waryong. One boy missed a taekwondo lesson. Rain arrived. The boys did not come home. Everything after that was inference. The families continued to believe the mountain held the answer. They returned to it, attended searches, and challenged official conclusions. The Fathers' truck became a moving memorial long before the country had bodies to bury. As the 10th anniversary approached, the case had become part of South Korea's collective memory. It was discussed as one of the nation's defining unsolved mysteries alongside other crimes that exposed the limitations of policing before modern forensic systems. But a mystery can become famous and still remain physically close. The boys were still on Mount Waryong. Their families, police, soldiers, volunteers, and reporters had passed years believing the answer might be anywhere in the country. Then, in September 2002, one person searching for acorns looked down at the right patch of ground. September 26, 2002, marked 11 years and 6 months since the boys disappeared. On the eastern side of Mount Waryong, a hiker searching for acorns came across a collection of bones, shoes, and clothing. The location was connected to the direction witnesses believed the boys had taken in 1991. It was near the mountain they knew, near their neighborhood, and near areas involved in the original search. Police were called to the hillside. The site quickly became an excavation scene. For the families, the discovery created 2 opposite reactions at once. It offered the possibility of an answer, but it also threatened to confirm the outcome they had resisted for more than a decade. Personal belongings and footwear suggested the remains could belong to the missing children. DNA testing later confirmed the identities. Cheol-won, Ho-yeon, Kim Young-gyu, Park Chan-in, and Kim Jong-sik had never left Mount Waryong. They had been hidden on the mountain while the country searched for them. The discovery should have allowed investigators to reconstruct the final hours. Instead, the way the scene was handled created new controversy. Families and media observers criticized the excavation process. Photographs and later accounts showed concerns that remains and objects were moved before the full forensic context had been documented. In an 11-year-old scene, the relationship between every bone, piece of clothing, cartridge, and section of soil mattered. Once disturbed, some information could never be recovered. The first public theory also arrived quickly. A day after the discovery, the local police chief said hypothermia was the most probable cause of death. Rain had fallen on March 26, 1991, and temperatures were low enough to be dangerous for children caught outdoors. The idea had surface logic. 5 boys could have become disoriented, taken shelter, huddled together, and died as the temperature fell. But the families rejected the explanation. Mount Waryong was familiar to the boys and close to populated areas. The remains had not been found at a remote peak after an impossible journey. If cold exposure caused the deaths, why had all 5 failed to reach a road, home, or village? Why had the bodies apparently remained together? Why did some clothing appear arranged or tied? And why were there signs of damage to the skulls? Forensic specialists from Kyungpoot National University examined the remains and reached a more disturbing conclusion. They believed the boys had been murdered. Their findings cited intentional trauma to at least 3 skulls. On Cheol-won's skull, the team identified shaped injuries they argued could not be explained by natural decay. They believed the damage had occurred around the time of death. The forensic team also considered the condition of the remains significant. The bones had not been widely scattered in the way expected after years of animal activity. Their arrangement suggested that the bodies may have been covered or buried soon after death. The competing conclusions created an immediate conflict. Police had publicly emphasized weather and exposure. Forensic experts emphasized violence and concealment. With only skeletal remains and a disturbed scene, certainty was difficult. A later forensic professor cautioned that it was impossible to determine a precise cause of death from bones buried for so long. But he also warned against ignoring visible trauma. The case had shifted from a disappearance to a suspected multiple homicide. And that meant the 11 lost years were no longer just a tragedy of searching. They were 11 years in which evidence degraded, memories changed, and a possible killer remained unidentified. Among the objects discovered near the remains were bullets and cartridge cases. That detail immediately intensified public suspicion because the site was near a military shooting range. For years, one theory had suggested that the boys entered military land, saw something they should not have seen, or were accidentally struck during shooting practice. Under the most serious version of the theory, the remaining children were then killed to conceal the accident. The discovery of ammunition appeared, at first, to give that idea physical support. But the evidence was not simple. A shooting range can contain bullets and casings from different periods. Objects found in the same general soil are not automatically connected to the victims. Investigators had to determine whether ammunition was old, whether it was fired, how it entered the area, and whether any of the boys' remains showed evidence of gunshot wounds. The nearby military unit stated that no scheduled training had taken place on March 26, 1991, because the election made it a public holiday. That statement challenged the most direct version of the military theory, but it did not erase public suspicion. Unauthorized firing, individual activity, or inaccurate records were still imagined by commentators. Yet no confirmed evidence has publicly established that military personnel were present with the boys at the critical time. The forensic findings also did not produce a clear firearm explanation. The trauma described on the skulls appeared more consistent with impacts from an object than with bullets. Specialists considered different tools and shapes, but they could not identify a single proven weapon. Police reportedly believed the killings, if homicide had occurred, might not have been planned in advance. One possibility was that an offender became enraged and attacked the boys with an object available at the scene. That possibility raised another question. Who could control 5 boys at once? The age difference mattered. The youngest was 9, the oldest 13. They may have reacted differently to danger. If one child was attacked, the others could run, shout, or fight. An offender might need authority, surprise, multiple accomplices, or some way to prevent escape. The mountain's geography offered concealment, but it also created risks for an attacker. A screen could carry. Hikers, residents, or soldiers might appear. Moving or covering 5 bodies would take time. This led some investigators and commentators to believe the offender knew the terrain well. A person familiar with the paths, search patterns, and military boundaries might understand where activity could occur without being immediately seen. Others argued that the boys could have trusted the person, at least at first. There was no public proof for either idea. The scene also contained clothing and personal effects that generated debate. Families said some items appeared tied or arranged in ways inconsistent with 5 children simply lying down from cold. The exact meaning of those items remains disputed because the excavation and preservation of the scene were heavily criticized. In a strong investigation, the site itself can tell a story, where each child was positioned, whether clothing was removed before or after death, whether soil had been deliberately placed over the bodies, whether ammunition belonged to the same time period, whether footprints, fibers, or tool marks existed. After 11 years underground, and after the site was disturbed, many of those questions could not be answered with confidence. The hiker had found the boys. He had not found the person responsible. Cold cases are often described as puzzles waiting for new technology. But technology cannot always restore information that was never collected. The Frog Boys case illustrates that limitation. By 2002, DNA testing could confirm identity. Forensic anthropology could examine skeletal trauma. Specialists could analyze soil, objects, and the condition of remains. But the investigation still depended on the quality of the excavation. If bones were lifted before their exact positions were mapped, the original arrangement was lost. If soil was mixed, layers could no longer establish sequence. If items were handled without proper control, later testing could produce uncertain results. The families accused police of treating the discovery as an exposure death before forensic specialists had completed their work. They believed that assumptions shaped the scene response and weakened the homicide investigation from its first hours. Police faced a difficult environment. News crews gathered quickly. The site was outdoors and vulnerable to weather. 11 years of roots, rain, animals, and soil movement had already altered the evidence. Even a careful excavation would have faced major limits. Yet the early hypothermia statement made the authorities appear to have decided the explanation before all the evidence was examined. This mattered because the case already carried a history of mistrust. The parents believed police had initially delayed. They believed witness reports had been overlooked. They believed the mountain and military area had not been searched with the right assumptions. Now, at the moment their sons were found, they believed investigators were again choosing the easiest conclusion. Forensic experts did not claim that every mystery was solved. They could not name the killer or establish an exact sequence. Their central point was narrower and more serious. The skull injuries and apparent burial pattern were not consistent with a simple accidental exposure narrative. Police temporarily classified the deaths as homicide. Investigators reviewed the old case with a new question. Instead of asking where the boys went, they had to ask who might have been with them on the mountain. They returned to witnesses. They reconsidered the reported scream. They examined the military range theory. They reviewed people who knew the area, offenders with histories involving children, and individuals connected to tips from the 1990s. But the suspect pool was enormous. More than 11 years had passed. People had moved. Some had died. Records were incomplete. Memories that seemed clear in 1991 had been influenced by years of media coverage and repeated questioning. There was no confirmed last person seen with the boys. There was no verified vehicle. There was no recovered murder weapon. There was no usable confession. There was no public DNA profile identifying an outsider at the scene. The discovery had transformed the case, but it had not supplied the one thing investigators needed most: a direct link to a person. In the years after the remains were found, several explanations competed for public attention. The first was accidental death from weather. Supporters of this possibility pointed to the rain, low temperature, and the risk of hypothermia in wet clothing. Children can become confused and weak in cold conditions, especially if they shelter rather than continuing downhill. The weakness of the theory was the forensic trauma. It also did not fully explain the apparent condition of the bodies or why 5 children familiar with the area remained together without reaching help. The second major theory involved the military shooting range. The ammunition near the site and the proximity of military land made this idea difficult to ignore. Some people imagined an accidental shooting followed by a cover-up. Others suggested the boys encountered soldiers engaged in unauthorized activity. The weakness was the absence of confirmed gunshot evidence and the military statement that no training was scheduled that day. No documentary record, witness, or forensic match has publicly proven military responsibility. A third theory proposed a local attacker. Such a person might know the mountain, understand where children played, and recognize an isolated location. The offender could have carried a tool or used an object found nearby. The attack might have begun as a confrontation rather than a planned abduction. This fit the theory of sudden rage considered by investigators, but no local suspect was tied to the scene with reliable physical evidence. A fourth theory suggested multiple offenders. Controlling 5 boys would be easier for a group. The boys might have encountered older teenagers or adults engaged in illegal behavior. A confrontation could escalate, and several offenders could conceal the bodies more quickly. This idea attracted renewed attention in 2022 when an anonymous online writer claimed the boys had encountered high school students who were inhaling glue and that vernier calipers had been used as weapons. The post spread because the tool's shape appeared to some readers similar to the injuries described on one skull. A vocational high school had existed near the area, which made the story sound specific. Daegu police responded that they had already received suggestions about vernier calipers in 2002. Investigators said forensic examination had concluded that the injuries did not match that tool. The anonymous claim did not identify a verifiable offender or produce supporting evidence. It became another theory that sounded detailed but could not be proved. A fifth theory focused on an accident followed by concealment. Under this possibility, the boys may have died through an unintended event, perhaps involving machinery, a fall, or hazardous activity. Someone who feared blame then covered the bodies rather than reporting the deaths. This could explain why a person without a prior plan might hide 5 victims, but the trauma pattern and lack of a confirmed accident site make the theory uncertain. Each explanation solves one part of the case and creates another problem. Hypothermia explains the weather but not the injuries. Military involvement explains the ammunition but lacks a proven shooting. A lone local attacker explains knowledge of the mountain, but not easily the control of 5 children. Multiple offenders explain control, but no group has been reliably identified. An accidental event explains the absence of a clear motive, but not the evidence interpreted as intentional violence. The result is a case with many plausible fragments and no complete proven narrative. That distinction is important. A documentary can explain theories. It cannot turn a theory into fact because it produces a satisfying ending. In the Frog Boys case, no ending has been proved. While investigators searched for a suspect, another clock was running. At the time of the disappearance, South Korean law imposed a 15-year statute of limitations for murder. If the case was treated as a homicide committed on March 26, 1991, the legal period would expire in March 2006. The discovery of the remains in 2002 left investigators less than 4 years to identify and charge an offender. The families had already waited 11 years simply to learn where their sons were. Now they faced the possibility that the law would close the case before the killer was known. Investigators continued reviewing evidence, but no arrests came. In 2005, the bereaved families sued the government, arguing that failures in the police investigation had prevented the truth from being found. They criticized the early response, the search, the handling of witness information, and the excavation. The court ruled that there had been no violation of law sufficient to establish government liability. The decision did not repair trust. On March 25, 2006, the statute of limitations expired. From that point, even if investigators identified the person responsible under the law then applicable, a murder prosecution for the 1991 deaths could not proceed. This legal ending was not an investigative answer. It did not establish how the boys died. It did not identify a suspect. It simply removed the possibility of punishment through a murder charge. The case became part of a wider national debate over time limits for serious crimes, especially crimes against children. South Korea later extended limitation periods and, in 2015, abolished the statute of limitations for first-degree murder. But those changes did not automatically restore a prosecution already time-barred under the earlier rules. The Frog Boys case helped symbolize why many families oppose the idea that time alone should protect a killer. Evidence can take decades to develop. Technology can reveal DNA that older laboratories could not analyze. Witnesses may speak after loyalties change. A body may be found years after a disappearance. In this case, more than 11 of the available 15 years passed before the victims were discovered. The families had not delayed justice. The mountain had. The boys disappeared in 1991. Their remains were found in 2002. Their funerals took place on March 26, 2004, exactly 13 years after the day they left home. For more than a decade, the parents had existed without a grave. The funeral gave the families a place to gather, and a ritual the disappearance had denied them. The remains were cremated, and most of the ashes were scattered in the Nakdong River. But the parents made an extraordinary decision regarding the skulls. They kept them as potential evidence. The choice shows how completely the search for justice had entered the family's grief. A funeral usually marks separation from an investigation. In this case, the parents believed the most important evidence might still be needed if forensic science improved or a suspect was found. The skulls contained the injuries that had caused experts to challenge the hypothermia conclusion. Preserving them meant preserving the possibility of another examination. It also meant the case could never become only a memory. The families continued attending memorials and speaking publicly. Their statements focused not only on who killed the boys, but on why the 5 children were taken and why the investigation had failed to answer that question. Some of the fathers died without learning the truth. By late 2025, reporting indicated that the fathers of Kim Jong-sik, Kim Young-gyu, and Park Chan-in had passed away. The remaining parents continued to live with the same unresolved facts. Their sons were found. Their son's killer, if forensic conclusions are correct, was not. In 2019, South Korea watched a different cold case change through modern forensic science. DNA testing helped identify Lee Chun-jae as the perpetrator in the Waryong serial murder cases, crimes committed between 1986 and 1991. The breakthrough showed that evidence stored for decades could still produce an answer. That same year, Daegu police reopened the Frog Boys investigation. The Unresolved Cases team began reviewing the matter from the beginning. Evidence was submitted for reanalysis. Investigators revisited records and accepted new civilian tips. The reopening offered hope, but the available material was limited. A Daegu police official later explained that the original evidence collection, because the remains were found so late, consisted mainly of bones, soil, and a plastic bag. Investigative records filled several cabinet drawers, but paper volume could not replace missing physical evidence. The National Forensic Service re-examined material. Police reviewed around 100 civilian tips. No result publicly identified a suspect. The contrast with the Waryong case was painful. Both cases had haunted South Korea for decades. Both involved criticism of older police practices. Both remained culturally prominent. But the Waryong files included biological evidence that could be matched through improved DNA testing. The Frog Boys scene did not provide the same clear path. Technology is powerful when the correct sample survives. It cannot create a perpetrator's DNA profile if no reliable sample was preserved. It cannot reconstruct where every object lay before excavation. It cannot make an unknown witness remember a face never recorded in 1991. The reopened investigation continued, but progress was slow. Police said they would request periodic reanalysis as forensic methods improved. For the families, that promise carried both hope and exhaustion. They had heard for decades that the next tip, the next examination, or the next specialist might provide the answer. Before we continue, remember that this case involves real children and real families, not fictional characters. If you share or discuss it, separate confirmed evidence from online theories. That distinction is one of the few forms of respect still available in an unsolved case. March 26, 2021, marked 30 years since the 5 boys disappeared. By then, the neighborhoods around Mount Waryong had changed. South Korea had changed. Policing, media, and forensic science had changed. The boys had not. In photographs, they remained 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. Daegu installed a memorial near Mount Waryong, honoring the children and expressing a public wish for child safety. Police announced continued review of the case and a willingness to investigate new information. Memorials can preserve memory, but they can also show the distance between remembrance and justice. The location where the boys were found remained a physical fact. Anyone could look at the mountain and understand that the answer had been close to the original search. That nearness is what makes the case especially difficult to accept. If the remains had been carried far away, the failure to find them might seem understandable. If the boys had entered a vehicle, the search area could have expanded without limit. But they were on Mount Waryong. The mountain was searched by police, soldiers, and civilians. How did everyone miss them? Several possibilities exist. The site may have been just beyond the main grid. Vegetation and terrain may have hidden the bodies. The boys may have been concealed more effectively than later soil conditions suggested. Searchers may have passed close by without recognizing disturbed ground. Maps and boundaries may have created gaps between teams, or the bodies may not have been at the exact site during every phase of the original search. That final possibility is sometimes raised in public discussion, but no verified evidence has established that the remains were moved years later. It remains speculation. The more responsible conclusion is simpler. Large searches can fail, especially when teams do not know whether they are looking for living children, injured hikers, hidden bodies, or evidence of abduction. A search pattern designed to find movement, voices, and visible clothing may miss a shallow, concealed site. Once the first days pass, weather and vegetation can erase the signs that would have drawn attention. The mistake then repeats. Later searchers assume heavily examined ground is less important and focus on new areas. A hidden location survives not because no one comes near it, but because everyone believes someone else has already checked it correctly. In June 2022, the case surged back into public discussion after an anonymous post appeared on NatePan, a South Korean online community. The writer claimed to know the weapon used in the Frog Boys case. According to the post, the boys encountered older students from a nearby vocational school who were inhaling glue on the mountain. The confrontation supposedly ended in murder, and the writer claimed vernier calipers were used as weapons. The claim spread rapidly. It offered what unsolved cases rarely provide: a specific group, a possible motive, and an unusual object that could be compared with the skull injuries. Online users examined photographs of calipers and diagrams of the trauma. Some treated the post as a confession by association, even though the writer did not provide verifiable names, records, or physical evidence. Daegu police publicly addressed the claim. They said the possibility of vernier calipers had already been reported when the remains were found in 2002. Forensic investigators had considered the idea and concluded that the injuries did not match the tool. Without corroboration, the anonymous story did not become a solved lead. The episode demonstrates how modern attention can both help and harm a cold case. A widely shared post can reach a witness who never spoke. It can recover photographs, records, or memories. It can pressure authorities to explain what was previously hidden. But it can also turn a visually interesting theory into accepted truth before evidence exists. In this case, the caliper claim became popular because it seemed to explain the shaped skull trauma. Yet similarity in an online image is not forensic identification. A tool marked conclusion depends on dimensions, force, angle, bone condition, decomposition, and the possibility that soil pressure changed the remains. The police rejection does not prove what the real weapon was. It only means this proposed answer was not supported by the forensic review available to investigators. The case returned to the same position. A theory had arrived with confidence. Evidence had not arrived with it. After decades of reporting, investigation, and speculation, only a limited number of facts can be stated with confidence. 5 boys left their homes in Daegu on March 26, 1991. They intended to go toward Mount Waryong to collect salamander eggs. They did not return, and one failed to attend a taekwondo lesson shortly after 1 in the afternoon. Rain and cold affected the area that day. The disappearance became a national case, producing one of South Korea's largest missing person searches. The fathers spent years traveling and distributing information about their sons. The remains were discovered on Mount Waryong on September 26, 2002, by a hiker searching for acorns. DNA identified the remains as the 5 missing boys. Police initially suggested hypothermia. Forensic specialists identified trauma on at least 3 skulls and concluded that homicide was likely. Bullets and cartridge cases were found near the site, but no public evidence has proved that military personnel caused the deaths. No murder weapon has been conclusively identified. No suspect has been charged. The applicable statute of limitations expired in 2006. Police reopened the investigation in 2019 and continued reviewing evidence and tips, but as of the latest reliable reporting, the case remained unsolved. Everything beyond those points requires caution. We do not know whether the boys were approached by someone they knew. We do not know whether the crime was planned. We do not know whether one person or several people were involved. We do not know whether the ammunition was connected to the deaths. We do not know the exact weapon. We do not know why the boys were not found during the original searches. We do not know whether the reported scream came from them, and we do not know why anyone would attack 5 children on a mountain close to their homes. An honest documentary must leave those spaces open. Although no complete sequence has been proved, investigators and forensic findings allow a cautious reconstruction of what may have happened. The boys left their neighborhood in the morning and reached Mount Waryong by a route they knew. Their plan was ordinary and likely did not involve traveling far. At some point before the afternoon taekwondo class, something interrupted the outing. They may have encountered a person or group on the mountain. The encounter may have begun without immediate fear. A uniform, an older student, a local worker, or a familiar adult could cause children to stop rather than run. A confrontation then occurred. The skull trauma suggests physical violence against at least some of the boys. The absence of a verified weapon means the object could have been carried by the offender or found in the area. The other children may have remained because events unfolded quickly, because they were threatened, or because multiple people were present. After the deaths, the bodies appear to have been concealed together. The condition described by forensic specialists suggested covering or burial sufficient to reduce animal disturbance. The offender or offenders then left without creating a confirmed witness trail. Rain may have assisted concealment by flattening soil, washing away tracks, and keeping people away from mountain. The election may also have helped indirectly. Public attention and police resources were focused elsewhere during the earliest hours. When searches expanded, teams may have approached the scene with the belief that the children were alive and moving. A concealed site near a boundary or outside the strongest grid could be overlooked. Once missed, it became easier to miss again. This reconstruction explains the central facts, but it remains a hypothesis. It does not identify the attacker. It does not prove motive. It does not explain the ammunition. It does not tell us whether the reported scream marked the moment of violence. And it cannot repair the evidence lost between 1991 and 2002. The Frog Boys case remains powerful for several reasons. First, the victims disappeared together. When one child goes missing, investigators may consider family conflict, individual risk, an accident, or a targeted abduction. 5 children disappearing at once narrows some possibilities while making the event harder to explain. Second, the destination was known. The boys were not traveling secretly or running away. They told another child where they were going. Searchers had a mountain, not an entire country, as the logical starting point. Third, the remains were found close to home. The discovery proved that the central answer had always been near the original route. Fourth, the case contains physical clues that appear meaningful but remain ambiguous. The skull trauma points toward violence. The ammunition points toward the nearby range. The arrangement of the remains points toward concealment. But none of those clues identifies a person. Fifth, the investigation crossed a major period of change in South Korea. The boys vanished on a historic election day as the country's democratic institutions were developing. They were found in an era with better DNA testing and a more aggressive media environment. The case was reopened after modern forensics solved other old crimes. At every stage, the available tools improved, but the original missing evidence remained missing. Finally, the parents refused to let the case disappear. Their search truck, flyers, lawsuits, memorials, and public appeals kept the boys visible for decades. Without that persistence, the story might have become a local file rather than a national symbol. The parents did not solve the case. They prevented the country from forgetting that it was unsolved. There's a photograph from the long search years that captures the heart of the case. It shows the fathers carrying the faces of their sons into public spaces, asking strangers to look carefully. The boys are frozen at the ages they were in 1991. The fathers keep moving. That is what an unresolved disappearance does to a family. Time continues for everyone except the missing person. When the remains were found, the families finally learned where the children had been. But location was only one part of the answer. They still did not know who was there with them. They did not know what the boys saw. They did not know what caused the confrontation. They did not know why 5 children were concealed on a familiar mountain. The hikers' discovery ended the search for the boys' bodies. It began the search for the truth of their final hours. More than 3 decades after the disappearance, the Daegu police still hold files, bones, soil samples, objects, and tips. Investigators can ask laboratories to look again. They can compare new information with old records. They can listen when a witness decides that silence has lasted long enough. But the case may depend on something science cannot manufacture. A person who knows what happened. Someone may have seen the boys on the mountain after the last known account. Someone may remember a relative returning home wet, frightened, or injured. Someone may know why a particular person followed the Election Day holiday closely. Someone may recognize an object connected to the injuries. Someone may have heard a story presented as a rumor that was actually a confession. The boy's parents spent years asking the country to look at 5 faces. Today, the remaining task is different. Investigators need someone to look at a memory and decide whether it belongs to this case. Until that happens, Mount Waryong holds 2 realities at once. It is an ordinary mountain near a city, a place where children once went to play. And it is the site of one of South Korea's most painful unanswered questions. 5 friends vanished there in 1991. 11 years later, a hiker found them. But even after the mountain returned their remains, it did not return the name of the person responsible. Woo Cheol-won, Ho-yeon, Kim Young-gyu, Park Chan-in, Kim Jong-sik. They should be remembered as 5 children, not only as a nickname, a mystery, or a case file. The evidence supports the conclusion that their deaths were suspicious and likely violent, but no court has established who killed them. Every theory discussed in this documentary remains unproved unless supported by confirmed forensic or investigative findings. The most accurate ending is therefore not a dramatic accusation. It is a statement of fact. The boys were found. The case was not solved. And for the families who spent decades waiting, those are 2 completely different things.